By the time the trial of Dale Wayne Eaton began, Casper had already lived with Lisa Marie Kimmell's name for 15 years. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a wound that had shaped the town, the state, and the people who had carried her memory through silence, snow, and time. The man at the center of it sat motionless at the defense table, a wiry figure with eyes that seemed to look through everything and nothing. For the families watching, he was the ghost who had haunted Wyoming Highway 26 since 1988. For the investigators, he was the face behind the evidence, the living embodiment of the violence buried beneath the Bonita dirt. The courtroom itself was a contradiction, sterile but charged, its fluorescent light falling on decades of pain. Reporters filled the benches, locals packed the aisles, and the Kimmells took their familiar place in the front row. The same family who had searched for answers long after the headlines faded, now watching justice unfold in real time. Over the coming weeks, the prosecution would reconstruct Lisa's final hours, piece by piece, through DNA, forensics, and testimony that left the room silent. The defense, in turn, would reach for the only lifeline left, to portray Eaton as a broken man rather than a calculating killer. But the evidence, the science, and the truth had already spoken. This wasn't just a trial. It was the reckoning Wyoming had been waiting for. A story that began on a lonely stretch of highway was now unfolding beneath the bright lights of justice. And for Lisa Marie Kimmell, for her mother, for her family, for everyone who had carried her memory through years of silence, the time had finally come for judgment and justice. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hi, John. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty damn good, really.
Pretty damn good, even.
I think pretty damn good, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've actually said that, I think.
Pretty damn
Pretty
good?
Damn good.
Yeah.
With conviction.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't have any complaints. It's pretty freaking good.
I like it.
It's Friday, right?
It is Friday.
Yeah.
It is.
So that's gotta be exciting. You got any great big weekend plans?
A whole lot of crocheting.
A lot of
freaking projects.
Yeah.
Tied myself into. I did it myself.
You did get it to yourself.
Yeah.
So.
I can say no, I just don't.
I understand. And you got a big heart, so it's hard to say no.
I know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's just the truth. I mean, you do all this crocheting to give away to people, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, you ready to jump into this new episode?
I am. Let's do it.
All right, so welcome, listeners, back to Dark Dialogue, Rocky Mountain Reckoning, the series where we return to the crimes rooted deep in the dirt and the snow of the American West, the ones that never left the hearts of the people who lived through them.
We investigate the stories buried under snowfall, prairie dust, and decades of unanswered questions. The ones whispered through dry creek beds, across high plains, and beneath the weight of history itself.
In tonight's episode, Judgment and Justice, we step inside the Natrona County Courthouse, where the trial of Dale Wayne Eaton brought 15 years of silence to a close. This was more than a prosecution. It was a confrontation between truth and denial, evidence and evasion, light and the long shadow of violence that had haunted Wyoming since 1988.
We'll walk through the testimony, the verdict, and the sentence that would make state history. The first death penalty handed down in Wyoming in decades. We'll also hear the voices that mattered most. Lisa's family, who faced Eaton in open court, and the community that stood behind them when justice finally spoke aloud.
Before we begin, take a moment to follow Dark Dialogue, Rocky Mountain Reckoning wherever you listen to podcasts. Give the show a thumbs up, leave a review, hit the bell so you never miss an episode, and share it with someone who still believes the truth deserves to be told.
Because every time you share, follow, or review, you help us bring attention to the victims who can't speak for themselves, and keep their stories from fading into the silence of forgotten places.
This is part 6, Judgment and Justice. The trial of Dale Wayne Eaton wasn't just about the law. It was about what Wyoming owed to one young woman and the truth she carried all the way home. The morning air in Casper was sharp, the kind that cuts straight through a coat and into a memory. Snow from the night before clung to curbs and car roofs, melting in thin rivulets that traced the edges of Center Street. For most people, it was just another winter morning. But for the Kimmells and for the state of Wyoming, it was the beginning of something they'd waited 16 years to see. News vans idled near the courthouse steps. Reporters rehearsed their lines, microphones already pointed at the old limestone building that had become the heart of the story. Deputies stood watch, radios murmuring as they checked credentials and searched bags at the door. Inside those walls, a trial was about to begin. Not just a case, but a reckoning. The accused killer of Lisa Marie Kimmell was finally facing judgment before a Wyoming jury. The courthouse loomed against the pale sky, solid, silent, and immovable. Its stone facade seemed to absorb the weight of what was coming, as if even the building itself understood the gravity of the day. To understand what unfolded in that courtroom, you have to see the place where it happened, a space built not just for justice, but for the burden that comes with it.
Casper, Wyoming, a city pressed between river and ridge, where the North Platte twists through the heart of the plains and the low mountains stand like worn sentinels on the horizon. At its center rises a monument to justice, the Natrona County Courthouse, an austere, stone-clad structure on Central Street that has watched generations of Wyoming's hardest stories unfold within its limestone walls. Completed in the early 1940s, the courthouse embodies a Depression-era style sometimes called stripped classical. Stately but spare, monumental without excess, its central block climbs 3 stories high, flanked by lower wings. Above and below the recessed windows, bas-relief friezes trace the state's identity in stone. Bison and hunters, cowboys and oil derricks, reminders that even architecture out here remembers its frontier roots. At the top of the granite staircase, the doors open inward like a threshold between eras, the plain facade giving way to quiet grandeur. Inside, the courthouse is solemn and unexpectedly elegant. Terrazzo floors shimmer under fluorescent lights. The marble walls rise cool and steady, reflecting decades of footsteps and verdicts. Wide staircases climb towards the higher floors, and on the first level, bronze elevator doors gleam with ranching motifs. Cattle brands etched into metal, nods to the land that built the city. Up one more flight, past the echo of polished banisters, waits the main courtroom, the chamber where the trial of Dale Wayne Eaton would unfold. The district courtroom is large, wood panel, and timeless. High ceilings amplify every word. The judge's bench dominates the front wall, elevated like an altar of law. The jury box runs along one side, 12 seats aligned in strict geometry. 4 rows of pew-style benches fill each side for observers. First, the endless pool of potential jurors, and later, the public, the press, and the families who would sit through every word. Light filters through tall, narrow windows, soft and indirect, so that even midday feels restrained. The acoustics are exacting. A whisper carries like a confession. In that room, silence means everything. With the start of Eaton's capital murder trial on March 3, 2004, security was absolute. Deputies screened everyone at the entrance, their radios whispering beneath the sound of boots on marble. Officers stood at both doors and along the gallery edge, ever watchful. Eaton was considered volatile, unpredictable, and early motions argued over whether visible restraints would prejudice the jury. The court compromised, safety maintained, dignity preserved. Inside, the emotion was palpable. Sheila and Ron Kimmell sat together near the back, surrounded by friends and supporters. Their presence was unmistakable, quiet, constant, and impossible to ignore. Reporters took notes, the jurors filed in, and when the prosecution began its case, the courtroom grew still enough to hear the wind outside. Then came a moment no one forgot. Prosecutors played a preserved recording of Lisa's voice, captured 16 years earlier during a routine traffic stop. Her words, bright and steady, echoed through the chamber, filling it with the sound of a life that should have continued. Reporters wrote that even the deputies looked away. Some jurors wiped tears. The Kimmells held hands. For a brief, shattering moment, Lisa herself was there. As testimony began, the newly seated jurors faced the evidence, photos, timelines, the science that tied Eaton to Lisa's final hours. Around them, the courthouse seemed to tighten with each word, its limestone and marble absorbing the weight of truth. Outside, downtown Casper stirred with cameras and news crews, the courthouse standing like a sentinel, pale, deliberate, and unblinking. The building had witnessed a century of Wyoming's hardest reckonings, but none more symbolic than this. Within those walls, history and heartbreak, past and present, all converged into one unrelenting fact. Justice had finally found its stage.
Before the first word of testimony was spoken, before evidence filled the screens and exhibits were passed through the trembling hands, the trial of the state of Wyoming versus Dale Wayne Eaton began with a question. Who would be allowed to listen? On Monday, February 23rd, 2004, jury selection opened inside the Natrona County District Court. The process was deliberate, tense, and weighted by the gravity of what lay ahead. It wasn't just about finding 12 citizens. It was about finding 12 people who could carry the burden of judgment in a case that had haunted Wyoming for nearly 16 years. And I gotta say, I pride myself on, I've been called for jury duty every freaking time every time they pull a jury, they pull my freaking name.
Always called.
Every place I've ever lived.
Hey, how about John?
Literally. When I moved to Montana, you got pulled for jury duty. Ohio, jury duty. Wyoming, jury duty. Colorado, jury duty. And I just had a jury notice not very long ago.
I'm not allowed.
So I've never been seated because of my past with like being on the fire department and ambulance and everything. I always get tossed out.
But too much.
I always pride myself on, I think I would have the ability to be very impartial. I couldn't have never sat on this jury. I would have had to have been, because I would have been like,
it's your feelings.
Let me pull the noose. Let me put the noose on this bastard's neck. So there's no way. And I can't be, I'm not a rare in the state of Wyoming.
Right.
It had to have been hard as shit to find a jury that could be impartial.
I can't even imagine. I can't.
I mean, this was like one of the biggest stories that Wyoming had ever had. We've talked about that.
And that was everything's on social media.
Oh, yeah.
But harder now.
Oh, yeah. It's even harder now.
To find impartial people. Like, you have to actually go out to the boondocks and grab a farmer off his horse and make him...
I mean, the thing of it is it's Wyoming, so it's very low population. Mm-hmm. Usually, when something like this happens, the whole state knows about it. Like, you're going to be hard-pressed to find somebody that doesn't know about Amy Roll-Bechtold, who we'll be talking about in a later episode. And, if I think this piece of shit killed her too, if they ever found evidence and was able to drag them, and I doubt he would ever stand trial because but he's lost his mind.
I know. But we're waiting to find out if Amy Rowe was found.
Right. Yeah. It's a possibility. Mm-hmm. But I think you'd have a really hard time finding an impartial jury for that case in the state of Wyoming.
Yeah. Well, in Montana and Utah, Colorado.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
You'd have to go quite far.
So I can't imagine. It had to be really freaking hard to find a jury. So, but anyway, Judge David Park presided, a firm but even hand guiding the proceedings. His instructions were clear. This was a capital trial, and the potential punishment, death, made impartiality not only a duty, but a moral test. In the front row sat Sheila and Ron Kimmell, their faces calm, but their eyes telling the story of every day that they had waited for this one day. The atmosphere was heavy, reverent, silent, and steeped in the kind of emotion only long-delayed justice can bring. The next day, Tuesday, February the 24th, the attorneys began to slow personal work of voir dire, questioning potential jurors one by one. They asked about media exposure, biases, and most delicately, their stance on the death penalty. The defense seized on a local newspaper photo that had shown a noose, an image they argued could poison the atmosphere and inflame public sentiment. The issue became a flashpoint, a reminder that this trial wasn't unfolding in a vacuum. Through it all, the Kimmells watched quietly. The parents who had endured headlines, speculation, and years of silence now bearing witness to the system finally turning its gaze toward the man accused of taking their daughter's life. Wednesday, February the 25th, brought another full day of individual questioning. Dozens of citizens took the stand, some nervous, some resolute. All asked the same haunting questions. Could they remain impartial? Could they handle the details of a case that promised to revisit violence and grief in unflinching detail? Many could not. One after another, potential jurors were dismissed, some for cause, some at the attorney's request, until the benches of prospective panels began to thin. The next day, Thursday, February the 26th, the tone in the courtroom sharpened. One potential juror was reprimanded by Judge Park for impropriety, a small moment that carried large meaning. It served as a reminder that decorum and discipline would rule here. Park's courtroom would not become a stage for emotion, not with the stakes this high. When the court reconvened on Tuesday, March the 2nd, the pressure deepened. Judge Park approved the release of several key documents tied to possible testimony, a gesture of transparency that drew both praise and protest. Meanwhile, the attorneys remained locked in the slow grind of voir dire, vetting, debating, dismissing. By day's end, the jurors still weren't seated. The case's notoriety, the years of coverage, and the community's deep emotional connection had made neutrality almost impossible to find. But by that evening, the court confirmed that opening arguments would begin the following morning. The final 12? Ordinary citizens now burdened with extraordinary responsibility had been chosen. 16 years after Lisa's disappearance, the story that had traveled from riverbanks to headlines, from silence to discovery, was about to be told again. This time in the language of the law. And when the gavel struck the next morning, the trial for Lisa Marie Kimmell's murder would finally begin. The morning air over Casper carried a different kind of stillness, one born from expectation. The kind that settles over a town that's waited 16 years for its reckoning. By sunrise, the courthouse steps were already crowded. Reporters framed their shots. Locals leaned against the cold stone railings, watching history assemble itself in real time. Inside, the scent of polished wood and coffee clung to the marble halls of the Natrona County Courthouse. Deputies checked badges. Shoes clicked across terrazzo floors. Every sound seemed amplified, as if the building itself knew what was coming. Today wasn't just another day in court. It was the day Lisa Marie Kimmell's voice would finally return to a room built for truth. The evidence had been gathered, the jury had been chosen, and now, for the first time since 1988, the story that began on Wyoming Highway 26 was about to be told in full. This is where justice finally took the stand. So on Wednesday, March 3rd of 2004, the trial of Delwayne Eaton began inside Casper's 7th District Court, a moment many believed might never come. For 16 years, the Kimmell family had lived with uncertainty. That morning, as the courtroom filled to capacity, the search for answers finally gave way to the process of justice. At 10:30 a.m., opening statements commenced before a packed courtroom. Every row was filled. Reporters, investigators, supporters, and both the Kimmell and Eaton families seated in tense proximity. Judge David Park, calm but resolute, reminded the room of its gravity. This wasn't spectacle. It was a capital murder trial, one that could end in a sentence of death. His words carried a deliberate weight, grounding the proceedings in the solemnity the moment demanded. The town outside felt it too. Casper, small enough for familiarity, but large enough to hold a collective memory, seemed to pause. For many, this case had become personal, a reckoning for a state still haunted by Lisa Marie Kimmell's disappearance. By Thursday, March 4th, the jury was sworn in. 12 citizens drawn from days of grueling voir dire, each one sworn to weigh evidence and emotion in equal measure. The moment marked the official beginning of testimony, and with it, the first steps toward truth. The crowd was larger than ever. Spectators stood along the walls when the benches filled, their faces tight with expectation. The Kimmells took their place once again in the back row, hands clasped, surrounded by those who had never stopped believing Lisa's case could be solved. Then the courtroom darkened. Prosecutors stood and played a tape that hadn't been heard publicly in 16 years. A short recording of Lisa's voice, captured during a traffic stop, the sound filled the chamber. Her words, ordinary, polite, alive, drifted through the same air now holding her accused killer. Even seasoned deputies turned away. Jurors wept quietly. The silence after the tape stopped was heavier than any argument could ever have been. It wasn't evidence in the legal sense. It was remembrance, a humanizing counterweight to the cold precision of forensics that would dominate the days ahead. The early testimony built the foundation. Investigators walked the jury back to 1988, to Lisa's disappearance, the recovery of her body from the North Platte River, and the start of a 16-year search that led, finally, to Eaton's DNA. Forensic specialists explained the limits of their science. The cold water had preserved Lisa's remains but obscured the exact time of death. The passage of years had made some answers permanent mysteries. Still, the evidence was unrelenting. Photographs, lab reports, soil samples, the buried Honda CRX unearthed from Eaton's property and still wearing the Little Miss license plate. Each exhibit drew a tighter circle around the man at the defense table. As the trial's first week unfolded, the jury was shown the map of Lisa's last drive, the DNA profile that tied Eaton to her body, and the early outlines of testimony from jailhouse informants, pathologists, and investigators. Piece by piece, the story that had once been rumor and sorrow was transformed into proof. But it wasn't just a case about evidence. It was about the sound of a young woman's voice filling a courtroom after 16 years of silence, reminding everyone present why they were there and what had been lost. In that chamber, science met memory. The state had begun to build its case, and justice, at last, had found its footing. Thursday, March 4th, 2004. The first full day of Dale Wayne Eaton's capital murder trial began with ceremony, tension, and the kind of quiet that fills a room when everyone knows history is about to be written. Inside Casper's 7th District Court, sunlight filtered through narrow windows, catching on the polished brass of the courtroom's fixtures. Rows of wooden benches were already filled long before proceedings began. Reporters with notebooks open, true crime followers clutching press passes, and neighbors from across Natrona County who had followed the Kimmell family story for years. At the front sat Ron and Sheila Kimmell, side by side in their familiar seats. They had carried this case through every false lead, every silence, every heartbreak, and now, after 16 years, they were watching the system finally call their daughter's name aloud in pursuit of justice. The morning began with the formal impaneling of the jury. After days of painstaking voir dire, 12 citizens were sworn in, ordinary people now chosen to decide the fate of the only man ever charged in Lisa Kimmell's murder. Judge David Park administered the oath with deliberate calm. The jurors stood, right hands raised, and repeated the words that would bind them to weeks of testimony and sleepless nights. In that moment, the room felt smaller, the weight of 16 years condensed into 12 voices answering, "I do." Then came the moment that would define the day. Prosecutors approached the bench, conferred briefly, and then turned to the jury. With a nod from Judge Park, they pressed play on an old cassette deck. It was Lisa's voice, recorded during a traffic stop. The tape played for less than a minute, but it was enough to unravel composure across the room. The sound of her, the tone, the warmth, the ordinariness of her words carried through every corner of the courtroom, reverberating off wood paneling and marble. When it stopped, no one spoke. Observers would later describe the silence as absolute, the kind that doesn't invite breathing, let alone speech. Deputies lowered their heads. Jurors stared at the floor. Even the hum of fluorescent lights seemed to quiet itself. That single minute did what evidence never could. It reminded everyone that this case was not only about crime and punishment, it was about life interrupted. When testimony resumed, the mood remained heavy. Expert witnesses took the stand, beginning the long work of explaining how science had caught up to a killer who thought time was on his side. They told the jury about the cold, how Lisa's body had been preserved in frigid river water, how the years that had followed obscured certain truths, including the exact time of death. But those same years had also brought progress. DNA science had evolved. Testing, once impossible, had become definitive. And that science, coupled with persistence, had turned a mystery into a case file, a file into an indictment, and an indictment into this trial.
Can I ask a question that might not matter now, but hit me a minute ago? Eaton's family, were they behind him or were they behind Lisa's family?
So the only ones of his family that I was able to find much of anything about was two brothers and his nephew. I can never remember how his nephew described him. It wasn't my uncle. I'm pretty sure it was my dad's brother is how he would always describe him, something like that. And then I think that like everything that I've ever read has described the nephew as his brother's son.
His brother, he's like, no.
So those are the only three that I've really been able to find much of anything about, and they all can't stand the douchebag.
Right. That's why I asked, like, were they on the other side? Did they testify? Were they...
No, they all are supporting the Kimmells, to my knowledge.
Okay.
The ones that I was able to find anything about supported the Kimmells and think that he's a total piece of shit and that he's killed way more women than just her.
Well, I know that you've said the brother has told people where he's been and what he thinks of him. I was just wondering what side they were on in the courtroom.
Yeah.
You knew?
Not his side.
Okay.
I don't think anybody was on this douchebag side.
To speak volumes too.
Yeah. Yep. So the courtroom that day was a study in contrast, science and sorrow, procedure and pain, law and love, all existing in the same measured rhythm. Deputies stood watch at the doors. The press leaned forward to capture each word, and through it all, the Kimmells remained still, their presence steady as a heartbeat beneath the hum of testimony. By the day's end, one truth had already emerged. This wasn't going to be just another murder trial. It was going to be a reckoning for a family, for a community, and for a state that had waited 16 long years to speak Lisa's name inside a court of law. The first day of judgment had begun. Friday, March 5th, the third day of Delwayne Eaton's capital murder trial, would deliver one of the most haunting moments ever seen in a Wyoming courtroom. It was the day the jury came face to face with the evidence that had slept beneath the desert for 14 years. The day Lisa Marie Kimmell's black 1988 Honda CRX SI, the Lil Miss, returned to speak for her. Inside the 7th District Court, the air felt electric, a mix of dread and anticipation. The Kimmell family sat in silence, bracing themselves for what they were about to see. The defense table remained still. Eaton, as usual, stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The prosecutors began by projecting photographs of the car's recovery, images taken when the investigators unearthed it from a pit on Eaton's Bonita property back in 2002. The photos appeared one by one, a mound of compacted dirt, a glint of metal, the faint outline of a car's buried roof. Each frame told a story of deliberate concealment. The jury saw the CRX as it was found, crushed and caked in earth. The roof collapsed inward. Panels buckled from the pressure of years underground. Specialists described how Eaton had used heavy machinery to bury the vehicle, possibly a backhoe, flattening the mound afterward to disguise the grave. The disturbed soil layers and compressed earth made it clear. This wasn't chance, it was calculation. And inside that car, they found pieces of Lisa's life, her personal items still recognizable, fragments of her journey home that never ended. The prosecution's voice softened as they described each recovered object, connecting every fragment to the vibrant young woman whose voice had filled the courtroom the day before. Then came the forensic testimony. Crime scene technicians detailed how they had approached the excavation with precision, documenting each inch of soil, every trace of debris. They explained how the dirt had packed into every crevice of the car, preserving it almost like a time capsule. The same concealment that had hidden Lisa's final link from the world had also preserved the evidence that would destroy her killer's defense. Hair fibers, trace DNA, soil transfer. Every scrap became part of the narrative the state was building. The story told not through witnesses, but through the mute persistence of physical truth. As jurors examined the photographs, the gallery was silent. Some reporters stopped writing. One deputy later said that the stillness was, quote, so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. This wasn't just a car anymore. It was an artifact, a black metal coffin that had slept beneath Wyoming soil, holding the echoes of the crime it had witnessed. Prosecutors urged the jury to look beyond the metal and the rust, to see the intent, the deliberate burial, the calculated attempt to erase a life, to make a young woman vanish as completely as her car had been hidden into the earth. They reminded the panel that this wasn't a panicked act. It was organized, methodical, and deeply cruel. For the Kimmells, it was a second burial, one they had to witness with their own eyes. Ron kept his hand over Sheila's. Neither moved. They'd come to this trial to see justice done, even if it meant reliving every horror along the way. When the session ended, the photographs remained burned into memory. The Lil Miss had once been a symbol of freedom, Lisa's pride, her independence, her next step in life. Now, it stood as evidence, proof that even the best efforts to bury truth eventually fail. That Friday in a Wyoming courtroom, the earth itself had testified. It spoke through steel and soil and silence, and its message was undeniable. The car that spoke from the earth had told its story. And for the first time in 16 years, people were listening. Saturday, March 6th, day 4 of the trial. By now, the courtroom had heard the voice of the victim, seen the buried car, and felt the weight of years collapse into days, but nothing prepared anyone for what would come next. The testimony that revealed, in chilling detail, what Lisa Marie Kimmell endured in her final hours. The Natrona County coroner, who had performed Lisa's autopsy 16 years earlier, took the stand. His presence was formal, deliberate, the kind of calm that only deep familiarity with death can bring. Yet even his steady tone couldn't blunt the horror of what he had to describe. He began by revisiting the condition of Lisa's body when it was recovered from the North Platte River in 1988. The jurors leaned forward, pens forgotten, as he detailed the bruising and abrasions around her wrist. Marks so specific that they told a story all on their own. The patterning was distinct. Parallel ridges, linear abrasions, deep contusions beneath the skin. The coroner explained that these weren't the random scars of a postmortem injury or river debris. They were the unmistakable signature of restraint while alive, of a person who had been bound, struggling against her bindings as she fought for freedom. He told the court the bruises bore the pattern of a hamper braided nylon rope, rough, coarse, and textured. Not smooth fabric, not soft cord. The impression on Lisa's skin showed a surface that had bitten in during repeated strain, the kind left by rope that had tightened and loosened again and again as someone fought against it. In that moment, forensic science became unbearable truth. Lisa hadn't just vanished. She had been held, tied, and tormented, and the marks she left behind were her final testimony. The prosecution built on that evidence carefully, methodically. They paired the coroner's words with crime scene photographs and microscopic comparisons. Rope fibers recovered from Eaton's Manita property matched the same kind of coarse material. It was the kind of connection juries rarely see so clearly, a forensic link between the victim's body and the killer's tools. And it wasn't just about science. This testimony was about intent, a demonstration of control, cruelty, and calculation. The kind of deliberate suffering that prosecutors argued justified the death penalty. The courtroom sat frozen. Ron and Sheila Kimmell were there again, side by side, gripping each other's hands. They had endured years of silence, years of waiting for someone to put words to the horror their daughter must have faced. Now, those words came with surgical precision, stripped of emotion, yet heavier than any accusation could be. Several jurors wiped their eyes. One reporter described the scene as, quote, a silence that had shape, thick, heavy, suffocating. For the Kimmells, it was a second kind of truth. Lisa had been more than a name in the headlines or a voice on a tape. She had fought. The marks on her wrist proved it. When the coroner stepped down, he carried his notes, the same autopsy findings that had sat in evidence for 16 years, back to the table. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the attorneys paused before moving to the next witness. That morning in Casper, the science of death became the story of a young woman's final courage. The prosecution's case was no longer theoretical. It was human. It was tactile. And it left no one in that courtroom untouched. In the stillness that followed, you could almost hear it, the echo of a life that refused to disappear. Monday, March 9th, the trial of Delwayne Eaton had already peeled back every layer of horror, the buried car, the rope marks, the final moments of a young woman's captivity. But this day brought the testimony that would close the circle, the day the science itself took the stand. Two forensic scientists approached the witness box, one from the Wyoming State Crime Lab, the other from Cellmark Diagnostics, the private lab contracted for retesting in the early 2000s. Both carried stacks of reports, thick binders of data, and the weight of absolute certainty. Their purpose was simple but profound: to explain to the jury how a few microscopic cells preserved for 16 years had finally given Lisa Marie Kimmell a voice that could not be silenced. The first expert began with the collection process, how in 1988, during the original autopsy, forensic technicians had carefully swabbed and preserved biological material from Lisa's body and clothing. These samples were sealed, logged, and stored under controlled conditions, surviving time, temperature, and bureaucratic neglect. Decades later, as DNA science evolved, those same samples would be run through a new system, one that could identify a killer where fingerprints and eyewitnesses could not. It was called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the FBI's national database. When investigators uploaded the new DNA profile from Lisa's case, the computer returned a name, not a partial match, not a maybe, an unequivocal hit: Delwayne Eaton. The expert from Cellmark explained the math to the jury, not in abstraction, but in human terms. The probability that the DNA came from anyone other than Eaton was so remote that it could not be quantified in any practical sense, roughly 1 in several trillion. In other words, if every person on Earth, past and present, had been tested, the odds of a random match would still be down around 0.
Wow.
The jury sat motionless. There were no gasps, no whispers, just the realization that they were hearing something final, something absolute. The second expert detailed the safeguards, chain of custody, contamination controls, independent verification. Each point was explained with patience and precision, dismantling any hint of mishandling that the defense might later attempt. The prosecution's case, once a web of circumstance, was now a fortress of science. Then came the story of how the database match happened. Years after Lisa's murder, Eaton's DNA entered CODIS following his arrest in the Red Desert kidnapping and assault on the Breeden family, the violent encounter where he abducted a woman and a child and a husband at gunpoint had led to his incarceration and routine genetic swab. We know that a little bit more was in play because Wyoming did such a wonderful job of keeping their hands on this asshat.
Yeah.
And then finally, the federal government got a hold of him and charged him with felon in possession of a firearm, but it all stemmed from the Breeden family kidnapping. So that single moment, an administrative detail in a separate case, would reopen Lisa's when the match appeared in 2002. Investigators compared profiles, double-checked the samples, and realized the impossible. The man who had escaped justice for Lisa's murder was already sitting in prison. The courtroom heard those facts laid out like clockwork, methodical, verifiable, inarguable. By the end of the day, the prosecution had done something few thought possible back in 1988. They had resurrected a cold case through science, taking evidence once considered silent and giving it power to convict. For Ron and Sheila Kimmell, it was a strange kind of comfort. Science had done what years of searching could not. It had turned Lisa's absence into proof. Her truth had endured, sealed in evidence envelopes, waiting for technology to catch up. That Monday, the courtroom didn't just hear testimony. It heard the sound of inevitability. The truth, stripped of doubt, measured in strands of DNA and the persistence of time. In the end, it wasn't luck or confession that brought Dale Eaton to justice. It was Lisa herself, carried in that microscopic traces that she left behind, waiting 16 years to be heard. Thursday, March 10th, 2004. So by now the jurors had seen the evidence, had heard the science, and felt the weight of Lisa Marie Kimmell's story in their bones. But on this day, the voices that filled the courtroom would be far more personal and far more painful. Two men took the stand, each carrying pieces of truth no one wanted to hear. One had shared a cell with the killer. The other had shared his blood. The morning began when a man in shackles escorted to the witness stand, a convicted felon serving time for his own crimes. The defense shifted uneasily. The prosecution leaned forward. He was the kind of witness who made jurors skeptical, but as he began to speak, the courtroom realized this wasn't idle talk or prison gossip. He told them that Delwayne Eaton had confessed, not in bravado, not in passing, but in detail. Eaton had described a young woman in a black Honda. He talked about a river, about digging, and about the panic that followed once he realized that she'd been found. These weren't details anyone could have known from the news. They were specifics that hadn't been released, details investigators recognized instantly as genuine. The prosecution let the silence stretch between questions, giving each word time to settle. They wanted the jury to hear Eaton's confession for what it was, a man comfortable in captivity, talking too freely, too often, about what he'd done. For jurors, it was a haunting moment. The sound of guilt made real, not through lab results or crime scene photos, but through Eaton's own voice, as relayed by another man behind bars. And I was thinking it was his brother, but it was actually his son that had testified. So that afternoon, the prosecution called William Eaton, Dale's son. He was hesitant, eyes down, speaking carefully. The court could feel the tension in every pause, the unbearable act of testifying against your own father. William explained how, years earlier, his father had asked him for help removing the seat and stereo from an old car, a Honda. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but later, investigators told him the truth. Those car parts came from Lisa Marie Kimmell's Honda CRX. The parts had been installed in William's own pickup truck, a detail that prosecutors backed up with photographs and forensic evidence. Side-by-side comparisons showed that the stereo and the seats bore matching serials and wear patterns. Forensic analysis confirmed it beyond dispute. William's voice wavered only once, when he said he had no idea what his father had done. The weight of that revelation, years later, had broken whatever image of family he once held. By the end of the day, the courtroom felt drained. Lisa's parents sat quietly, hands intertwined, absorbing what they just heard, how their daughter's memory now connected to a father and a son on opposite sides of a witness stand. The jurors looked weary but alert, as if they understood that this was no longer just about forensics or rope fibers. It was about the echoes of violence that spread outward, touching everyone connected to it. One man's confession, another man's remorse, and between them, the story of a young woman who'd simply been driving home. That Tuesday, the walls of the 7th District Court held the sound of something no one could unhear, a killer's own words and a son's heartbreak. The prosecution didn't just prove the crime that day, they showed the cost of it and what it took from every life that it touched. Wednesday, March 11th, after 8 days of testimony, dozens of witnesses, and evidence that spanned 16 years of unanswered questions, the state of Wyoming was ready to rest its case. The prosecution had laid out its story piece by piece, from the discovery of the Lil Miss Honda to the science that tied one man's DNA to the end of a young woman's life. Now it was time for the final threads to be pulled tight. Before the state rested, prosecutors called one last expert, a forensic handwriting analyst. She approached the stand with binders, magnified exhibits, and a letter that had haunted Lisa Kimmell's family for years. It was known as the Stringfellow Hawk Note, a strange, taunting message left at Lisa's gravesite in Montana sometime after her death. Signed by the name of a TV helicopter pilot from the show Airwolf, it mixed condolences with coded familiarity, as if written by someone who knew far more than they should. The analyst explained her process, examining slant, spacing, pressure, and formation of letters. When she compared the note to samples of Delwayne Eaton's writing, checks, prison forms, signed affidavits, the similarities were overwhelming. The D's curled the same way, the G's hooked back at the top, and the letter's rhythm, its pattern of phrasing and misspellings, mirrored Eaton's known writing habits with what she called near certainty. Her conclusion was unequivocal. The man on trial for Lisa's murder had stood over her grave months later and left a message mocking investigators, taunting her family, and proving the need to control the narrative even after taking her life. The jury watched in silence as the letter was displayed. Black ink on white paper, simple and cruel. For Ron and Sheila Kimmell, it was a devastating moment. Confirmation that their daughter's killer had not only murdered Lisa, but returned to the memory of her, uninvited and unrepentant. By late afternoon, District Attorney Michael Blonigan stood, thanked the witnesses, and turned to the bench. The state rests, Your Honor. Judge David Park nodded, addressing the jury. He reminded them that this was not an ending but a pause, a moment for both sides to regroup before the defense began its case. For the first time in the trial, the courtroom exhaled. The long procession of witnesses, scientists, and experts had ended. The evidence now sat in front of 12 Wyoming citizens, a puzzle made of blood, handwriting, rope, and silence. Outside, reporters clustered on Center Street. The air was cold and dry, the courthouse's limestone walls glowing under the late afternoon sun. Inside, Eaton sat motionless, face unreadable, eyes fixed straight ahead. His attorney requested a brief recess before presenting their case. They would return on Friday. Behind closed doors, they were preparing a familiar strategy. Claims of mental instability, diminished capacity, and lifelong trauma. Their task now wasn't to prove innocence. It was to plant doubt, or at least humanity, in the mind of a jury that had just watched the state build a near-perfect chain of guilt. That Wednesday marked a shift in tone. The prosecution had finished speaking for Lisa. Now the defense would try to speak for the man who silenced her. The Stringfellow Hawk note lingered in the minds of everyone who'd seen it, a reminder that some killers can't help but look back at their work, as though daring the world to follow the trail. That night, the courthouse lights burned long after dark, and somewhere in Casper, the wind moved across the empty streets, whispering through a town that was still learning what justice sounds like when the truth is finally this close to be spoken out loud. By the time the defense rose to speak, the courtroom had changed. The prosecution's fire had burned hot for days. Forensics, eyewitnesses, and Lisa's voice echoing through the recording played again and again. Now came a different kind of quiet. When Dale Wayne Eaton's attorney stood, they didn't promise to prove his innocence. They promised to explain his existence, the broken life behind the monster the jury had already met. They spoke of childhood chaos, violence learned before reason, and a mind that never healed. To the jury, it was a plea for mercy. To the Kimmells, it was an unwelcome rewrite of their daughter's story. As the defense took the stand, the room tightened again, the kind of tension that comes when justice and forgiveness share the same air. And so began the final act of the trial of Dale Wayne Eaton, where his defense didn't fight for freedom, only to save his life. Friday, March 12, 2004. After 8 relentless days of testimony from the state of Wyoming, the courtroom turned its attention to the defense. The prosecution had painted a picture too complete to ignore. Science, motive, confession, and cruelty, each piece fitting perfectly into the story of Lisa Marie Kimmell's abduction and murder. Now it was Dale Wayne Eaton's turn to answer. The defense attorneys, weary, deliberate, began their case before the 7th District Court in Casper. They faced a near impossible task. Humanize a man already etched in the public's mind as a monster. They didn't claim innocence. They couldn't. Instead, they set out to sow uncertainty, to slow the momentum of a prosecution that had carried both science and sorrow on its side. The defense began with procedural motions, legal housekeeping, renewed challenges to the admissibility of evidence, objections to witness statements, and arguments over the chain of custody for the DNA samples that had ultimately tied Eaton to Lisa's murder. The motions were mostly denied. Judge David Park reminded the court that the evidence had been properly handled and scientifically verified, but the defense pressed on, highlighting technical nuances. Could DNA stored for 16 years degrade? Could the chain of custody be broken through human error? Their tone was less about persuasion and more about preservation, building a record for appeal even before the verdict was in sight. Then, the defense turned to the people behind the evidence, the witnesses themselves. Cross-examinations revisited the jailhouse informant's motives, suggesting fabrication in exchange for leniency. They questioned investigators about the possibility of bias, whether officers had become too invested in pinning the case on Eaton after the DNA match. It was a defense of shadows, pointing not to innocence, but to imperfection. By midday, the focus shifted. Eaton's public defenders began what most saw as the true heart of their case, an attempt to humanize a man long regarded as beyond sympathy. They described a childhood marked by neglect and violence, a man shaped by trauma, scarred by war and poverty, slipping gradually into isolation on the edge of Wyoming's high desert. Mental health experts painted a portrait of paranoia and instability, a person who mistrusted everyone, spoke to no one, and lived among the ruins of his own making. They stopped short of claiming insanity. Instead, they asked the jury to see diminished humanity, the mind of a man damaged by circumstance, not born of evil. If not mercy, they were hoping for something softer than vengeance. It was a fragile argument in the face of what the jury had already seen. Lisa's car unearthed from Eaton's property, her DNA, his confession, the letter left on her grave. Still, the defense clung to the only ground that they had left, the idea that punishment should reflect brokenness as much as brutality. The tone in the courtroom had changed. Gone were the gasps, the tears, the sharp energy of the prosecution's days. What remained was fatigue, the slow rhythm of technical questioning, the defense's careful voice asking jurors to imagine another version of Dale Eaton, one buried under layers of dysfunction and paranoia. But the jurors' faces told a different story. They weren't buying redemption. They'd seen too much. Reporters in the gallery wrote that Friday felt like, quote, a long exhale, end quote. The moment when everyone realized the defense wasn't trying to rewrite the case, only to soften the inevitable conclusion. As the session adjourned, Judge Park announced that the defense would continue the following week, with expert testimony expected on mental health and background. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with reporters again, and above the quiet press conference chatter, one phrase echoed through the evening broadcasts: the defense begins to humanize the monster. That day, it wasn't science or confession or law that filled the courtroom. It was something more haunting. The sound of a man's past being laid bare in hopes that it might somehow soften the future. But in the story of Lisa Marie Kimmell, there was little room left for sympathy. The jury already knew who he was, and the rest of Wyoming knew what he had done. Monday, March 15th, 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotion had led to this. Inside Natrona County 7th District Court, the murder trial of Dale Wayne Eaton was nearing its end. For Lisa Marie Kimmell's family, the moment felt both unbearable and inevitable. 16 years of silence collapsing into one day of truth. By morning, Judge David Park reconvened the court. The jury had heard DNA scientists, detectives, neighbors, and even Eaton's own son. They had seen Lisa's car, the Lil Miss plate, and listened to testimony that tied every fragment of evidence to the man seated at the defense table. Now came the final step: closing arguments. The prosecution moved first. Their tone was measured, not theatrical. They walked the jury through the timeline once more: the abduction, the sexual assault, the captivity, the murder, the burial, and the years Eaton spent pretending the past was buried with her. The prosecutor's words echoed across the wood-paneled room. Science does not lie. Time does not erase truth. Lisa Kimmell's voice is here in the evidence that she left behind. When they sat down, every juror was still. The weight of that evidence, unbroken, uncontested, hung in the silence. Then the defense attorney, Wyatt Skaggs, rose. For 3 weeks, he had questioned witnesses and challenged the process, hinting at mistakes and mental illness. But now, his voice was calm, almost resigned. He looked at the jury and said what no one expected. Quote, "My client did this." End quote. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. It was a rare, almost unheard of concession in a capital trial, a public admission of guilt by the defense itself. Skaggs explained that the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the car, the confession, the gravesite letter, all of it. He didn't argue innocence, he argued for life. His plea was simple, quote, spare him death, acknowledge his humanity, however damaged it may be, end quote. For Lisa's parents, Ron and Sheila, the moment was shattering. 16 years of searching ended not with defiance, but with surrender. That afternoon, Judge Park read the jury its final instructions. The law on first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, sexual assault, and robbery. He reminded them that their duty was not emotional but legal. Weigh the facts, apply the law, and render verdicts beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury retired to deliberate, the heavy doors closing behind them. Outside, the courthouse lawn was lined with television crews, families, and a few quiet onlookers who had followed Lisa's story since 1988. Within hours, the verdicts would come, and with them, the final confirmation that the man once hiding in Wyoming's wide desert had been brought into the light. That day, justice didn't arrive with fireworks or with headlines. It came in the simple act of truth spoken aloud from both sides of the aisle. A murderer's own attorney had stood in a courtroom and said the words everyone already knew but needed to hear. And as the sun set over Casper, the desert finally gave up its silence. The guilt phase was over. Only the question of punishment remained. Tuesday, March 16, 2004. The courtroom in Casper opened under a strained calm. The previous day's confession by defense counsel had left the air heavy with inevitability. The case of State of Wyoming versus Dale Wayne Eaton had been submitted to the jury. 12 people now carried the full weight of justice and the memory of Lisa Marie Kimmell into deliberation. But that morning, even justice found itself interrupted. Before the jury could begin its second day of deliberations, Judge David Park reconvened briefly in open session. One of the 12 jurors, he announced, had been excused. The reason wasn't made public. It could have been illness, an undisclosed bias, or a personal emergency. Anything that might threaten impartiality or fairness. Whatever the cause, it was serious enough to remove a seated jury during the final hours of one of Wyoming's most consequential trials. An alternate juror, one who had sat silently through every minute of testimony since the first day, was called forward to take their place. The courtroom remained still. In a capital case, any disruption to deliberations carries enormous consequences. Judge Park addressed the jury directly. He reminded them that deliberation must be unanimous and untainted. With a new member now among them, the law required a full restart, a complete renewal of the process. Every conversation, every preliminary vote, every shared opinion from the prior session, all of it was wiped clean. They were to begin again, from the start, as if the doors had just closed for the first time. It was a small procedural correction on paper, but in human terms, it meant tension, exhaustion, and emotion had to be relived all over again.
I can't imagine.
I'd be so freaking pissed off.
I can't.
I would be hunting that juror down and being like, you better have a freaking damn good reason.
It still to this day doesn't know why.
No, I couldn't find anything, no. And it's pretty common that they don't share that information publicly. The juror could have come forward to share it if they'd wanted to, but I couldn't find anywhere where they did, so it's just a mystery. So reporters outside the courthouse noted the development with quiet frustration. After 16 years of uncertainty, even a day's delay felt cruelly familiar. Another pause between hope and resolution. Inside, attorneys remained patient but anxious. The prosecution, confident but cautious, knew that time could dull impact. The defense understood that this procedural hiccup wouldn't change the outcome, but it gave them, briefly, another breath before the verdict came. As the day passed, the jury remained sequestered, reviewing the evidence under the same strict guidance they'd been given the day before. By dusk, no verdict had been reached. The courthouse lights dimmed, the long hallways emptied, and the people of Casper went home knowing that justice, like the Wyoming wind, can stall, shift, and test its own patience before it finally settles. March 16th was a reminder that even in the clearest cases, the human element can still interrupt the machinery of justice. But for Lisa's family, there was no doubt left to deliberate. The only question now was how long it would take the rest of the world to say, formally and finally, what they already knew. By the third day, the courthouse had gone quiet. Not the kind of quiet born from peace, the kind that comes when a room holds its breath. Outside, the March wind scraped against the old Natrona County Courthouse, carrying with it a chill of a state waiting for justice. Inside, 12 people sat behind closed doors, weighing 16 years of pain against one man's life. Every sound was magnified, every second stretched thin. Reporters hovered by the payphones. Deputies watched the elevator doors like they might reveal history itself. And for the Kimmell family, after so many years of searching, pleading, and warning, there was nothing left to do but wait. Then came the signal. The bailiff appeared at the end of the corridor, his face unreadable. The jury had reached a verdict. And with that, 16 years after Lisa vanished from a Wyoming highway, her voice was about to be spoken for one final time. Wednesday, March 17, 2004. It was just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the bailiff stepped quietly into Judge David Park's chambers with a folded note in his hand. Inside, the 12 jurors who had spent the past 2 days reviewing every piece of evidence, every photograph, every word of testimony, had reached a decision. After 16 years of silence, the case of the state of Wyoming versus Dale Wayne Eaton was about to be spoken into history. The courtroom filled in tense silence as the clerk announced that the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. Families, reporters, and local residents pressed into every available seat. At the front of the room sat Ron and Sheila Kimmell, holding hands, their faces fixed on the panel of jurors who now carried their daughter's memory in the weight of their decision. Judge Park reconvened court. He reminded the jury of their solemn duty to speak the truth as they found it, based on the law and the evidence. Then, one by one, the verdicts were read aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Dale Wayne Eaton, guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, guilty of felony murder, guilty of aggravated kidnapping, guilty of first-degree sexual assault, guilty of aggravated robbery. Each count was delivered with the steady rhythm of finality. Every word landed heavy, a sentence 16 years in the making. Eaton sat, expressionless, his eyes fixed ahead, hands folded loosely on the defense table. He showed no reaction, no anger, no remorse. For the Kimmells, that absence of humanity only deepened the loss. Sheila wept softly into her husband's shoulder. Ron kept his gaze on the bench, the same unwavering stare he'd carried through 16 years of heartbreak and unanswered questions. Outside, the courthouse lawn was filled with television crews and local residents who had followed the Little Miss story since 1988. When the verdict spread, people didn't cheer. They simply exhaled. Casper and much of Wyoming had carried the ghost of Lisa Marie Kimmell for far too long. Now there was a measure of peace. Reporters described the moment as quietly devastating. Justice had come, but not joy. Only the calm that follows when the truth can no longer be denied. The jurors, still visibly shaken, were dismissed under court protection and escorted away. Their work was not done. The penalty phase would begin next, determining whether Eaton would spend the rest of his life in prison or face execution. Eaton's conviction was monumental for Wyoming. It was one of the few times the state had secured a death-eligible verdict through cold case DNA evidence, setting a precedent for forensic prosecutions across the Mountain West. The Little Miss case had proven that science could resurrect truth from the ground. literally, and that persistence could bridge decades of silence. It also revived debate over capital punishment. In a state where executions were rare and death sentences rarer still, Eaton's conviction reignited questions of morality, justice, and whether any punishment could match the horror of Lisa's final hours. That afternoon, justice wasn't loud. It came in the sound of paper rustling, of a judge's voice steady and deliberate, of a mother's quiet sob against her husband's shoulders. The jury spoke, and the story that began on a Wyoming highway in 1988 found its ending in a Casper courtroom 16 years later. But as Ron and Sheila Kimmell left the courthouse that day, they knew this wasn't truly over. There was still one question left. Not who killed Lisa, but what justice would finally mean for the man that did. Thursday, March 18th, 2004, the guilt was settled. The question now was what kind of justice would follow. The penalty phase of the state of Wyoming versus Dale Wayne Eaton began in Casper's 7th District Court, 3 days that would test the emotional endurance of everyone inside that room. March 18th was the case for death. The prosecution opened by presenting aggravating factors, the brutality, premeditation, and cruelty of Lisa Marie Kimmell's murder. They portrayed Eaton as a calculating predator who had terrorized Lisa, buried her car to erase her life, and walked free for 14 years. Then came the witnesses who silenced the courtroom. A woman from 1997 who had survived one of Eaton's earlier violent attacks. Her story was harrowing. The fear, the force, the escape. It demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior. The escalation of a man who hurt strangers and felt nothing for their pain. Judge David Park kept her testimonies tightly controlled, reminding jurors that this was not a retrial of a prior assault, but proof of a continuing danger. And as she stepped down, even reporters wrote later that the air in the courtroom felt heavier than before. The prosecution ended that day with a plea that was not vengeful but resolute, a reminder of Lisa's voice, played again from the recording first heard during the trial's opening week. Her tone, polite, calm, unaware of what was waiting for her, became the emotional centerpiece of the state's argument for the ultimate penalty. March 19th was the plea for mercy. Friday brought the defense's turn, a final, fragile bid for mercy. They didn't deny Eaton's guilt. Instead, they traced his life backward through poverty, abuse, and mental illness. Defense witnesses spoke of a broken childhood, a violent father, and years of neglect that warped him long before Lisa ever crossed his path. A forensic psychologist from Utah testified that Eaton suffered from brain damage and chronic depression, impairing his ability to regulate emotion or control impulses. Under cross-examination, the state's attorney dismantled much of that claim, pressing the expert to admit that none of those conditions explain the deliberate concealment of evidence or the planning behind Lisa's abduction and murder. That same afternoon, a medical witness for the state described the sequence of Lisa's final injuries: the rope burns, the bruises, the prolonged restraint. The description was clinical, but every juror heard what it meant: pain, fear, and a deliberate will to dominate. By evening, the attorneys made their final arguments. The prosecution called for justice equal to the crime. The defense begged for a measure of mercy rooted in the failures that had shaped Eaton's life. March 20th, Saturday morning, the jury filed back into the courtroom after hours of deliberation, faces pale and drawn, as at the defense table, Dale Wayne Eaton sat motionless, staring at the floor. When Judge Park asked if the jury had reached a verdict on sentencing, the foreman stood and handed over a folded piece of paper. "We, the jury, have found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder, recommend the sentence of death." A collective breath escaped the room, half relief, half sorrow. Eaton showed no emotion. He simply blinked once, hands still resting flat on the table. For Ron and Sheila, the words were both an ending and an echo. Ron later told reporters, quote, "It doesn't bring Lisa back, but it tells her story matters," end quote. In the years that followed, Eaton would remain Wyoming's only inmate on death row, his sentence representing both a legal rarity and a moral reckoning for the state. Between March 18th and 20th, justice passed through every possible human emotion: anger, mercy, fear, and grief. The jury's decision was not just about Delwayne Eaton. It was about the worth of a life stolen and a community's refusal to forget her name. In the silence that followed the sentence, Ron and Sheila left the courtroom together, the Wyoming wind whipping down the courthouse steps. For the first time in 16 years, justice finally spoke Lisa's name aloud, and this time, it stayed in the air. In the middle of nowhere, between Casper and Shoshone, the wind never forgets. It moves across sagebrush and gravel, carrying the scent of dust, rust, and old memories. Here, on a lonely stretch near Manita, Wyoming, stood a small trailer in a patch of ground that once held a secret darker than the desert night. It was where Lisa Marie Kimmell's final moments unfolded, and where, years later, her family would return, not for vengeance, but for peace. After the verdict and the sentence, there was one place left to confront, one place that still belonged to the man who stole Lisa's life, but not for long. This is the story of how the Kimmells reclaimed the ground that remembered her and turned a monument to evil into an act of love, closure, and light. After the verdict and the sentence, one question lingered. What happens to the ground where the horror began? For Ron and Sheila Kimmell, that answer came not through another criminal court, but through civil law, a different kind of justice, quieter but just as lasting. While the criminal case still moved through the appeals, Sheila Kimmell filed a wrongful death suit in Natrona County 7th District Court. She wasn't seeking wealth. She was seeking ownership. Ownership of the place that had defined 16 years of pain. When Delwayne Eaton failed to answer the complaint, the court entered a default judgment in 2004. $5 million in damages, satisfied not by money but by property. Eaton's 10-acre parcel outside Manita, the same ground where Lisa's Honda CRX had been unearthed, the same soil that had kept her story buried for years. The court transferred title to the Kimmells. On paper, it was compensation. In truth, it was reclamation. The land itself was desolate, a windswept patch of sagebrush 30 miles from anything. A rusted trailer leaned into the wind, a collapsing shed beside it. This was where Eaton had brought Lisa, where he kept her, where he buried her car to erase the proof. Reporters who visited after the trial described it as a place without a sound. No neighbors, no power lines, only the hum of Wyoming air moving through dry grass and grief. The Kimmells debated on what to do with the land. Preserve it as evidence, sell it, or burn it. In the end, they chose fire. July 18, 2005, would have been Lisa Marie Kimmell's 36th birthday. The family returned to Manita with county officials and a small team of firefighters. They doused the trailer, the shed, every remnant of Eaton's life there. Flames tore through the structures, black smoke twisting into a clean Wyoming sky. One firefighter called it a cleansing by fire. For the Kimmells, it was more than symbolic. It was a way to make sure this place, this monument to cruelty, could never again exist as part of their story. When the ashes cooled, they sifted through what was left, ensuring not a single nail or tire rim remained. Then they left it to the wind and the sagebrush. Sheila later said, quote, "We didn't want revenge, we wanted peace," end quote. Owning and erasing that land gave the family something the legal system never could: control. They turned the site of Lisa's suffering into a memorial of resilience. There would be no museum, no markers, no dark pilgrimage for the morbidly curious, just silence, prairie grass, and the ghost of a daughter who deserved to be remembered for her life and not her death. By the next spring, the land had returned to its natural state, a quiet stretch of sage and sand without a trace of what once stood there. Ron and Sheila never looked back. They'd done what justice couldn't. They gave Lisa the final word. Some families build monuments. The Kimmells chose to erase one, and in doing so, they built something stronger, a legacy of love, defiance, and healing on the same ground where evil once stood. When the verdict came down in March 2004, it didn't end the story of Lisa Marie Kimmell. It only changed the way that it was told. The courtroom had given her family a legal victory, but what followed proved that justice is rarely simple and peace is never free. On March 17, 2004, Dale Wayne Eaton was convicted on every count: kidnapping, rape, robbery, and first-degree murder. 3 days later, the same jury handed down the rarest sentence Wyoming law allows: death. By June, Judge David Park entered the formal order. Eaton became the state's only death row inmate, confined in the maximum security wing of Rawlins while attorneys prepared appeals that would stretch for decades. For Ron and Sheila Kimmell, it was justice, but not closure. Sheila told reporters, quote, "Closure isn't real. It just means you've survived another part of the tragedy," end quote. They'd won the legal fight, but nothing could fill the silence where Lisa's laughter used to live. In interviews, the Kimmells spoke of relief tempered by exhaustion. Sheila admitted the pursuit of the death penalty was, quote, "the hardest damn decision of our lives," end quote. They'd fought for accountability, not vengeance, but accountability came wrapped in moral weight. When the court restricted their ability to show Lisa's memorial video or read their entire impact statement, the family was gutted. They wanted Eaton to see her face, to understand what he destroyed. Instead, they walked from the courtroom knowing he never would. Still, Ron and Sheila found meaning in the verdict. For them, it was the system acknowledging publicly what they already knew. Lisa's life mattered, and her story would not be buried again. Even after conviction, Sheila Kimmell refused to believe Lisa was Eaton's only victim. She told journalists she was certain there were others, women whose families never got the chance to stand in court. That belief pushed the Kimmells to remain visible, to speak out for victims of cold cases, and to pressure law enforcement to re-examine similar murders across the Mountain West. Their advocacy became part grief, part crusade, keeping Lisa's name alive while demanding answers for those still missing. The investigators who'd carried the case for 16 years, Sheriff Mark Benton, Corporal Lynn Cohee, and Highway Patrol Trooper Al Lesko, felt both vindicated and haunted. Lesko, the last man to see Lisa alive, admitted years later he still replayed that traffic stop in his mind, wondering if a different word, a longer pause, might have changed everything. Neighbors near Eaton's Manita property expressed disbelief. One woman said, quote, "We've known the man. You never really know what's behind a person's door," end quote. For the community, the case tore open an old truth about rural isolation, that evil can live quietly next door, hidden behind nothing but wind and distance. For a moment, the Kimmells felt peace, but legal battles don't burn away as easily as wood. Over the next decade, Eaton's attorneys would file appeals arguing ineffectiveness of counsel and mental health issues. By 2014, a federal court vacated his death sentence on procedural grounds, converting it to life without parole. The family's fury was palpable, not because they wanted blood, but because every appeal dragged Lisa's name back through paperwork and headlines. Sheila later said, quote, "It feels like we have to keep losing her again and again," end quote. Still, the meaning of those days in 2004 remained untouched. Justice had spoken once, loudly enough to echo for a lifetime. In the end, the Kimmells didn't just win a case. They reclaimed their story, the land, and the legacy of their daughter. They proved that even in a place as vast and unforgiving as Wyoming, love can still set the record straight. When the verdict came down in March of 2004, a chapter closed that had been open for far too long. 16 years of unanswered questions, of headlines and heartbreak, of sleepless nights and stubborn hope, finally met the weight of a gavel and the sound of the word guilty. For the Kimmell family, justice wasn't triumph, it was survival. They walked out of that courthouse not as victors, but as keepers of a promise to never let Lisa's name fade beneath the dust of time. The fire they lit on her 36th birthday didn't just consume a murderer's home. It cleansed a wound carved into the heart of Wyoming itself. What rose from those ashes was not vengeance, but peace, and a vow that no one's daughter should ever vanish into silence again. But peace, like justice, is never permanent. Dale Wayne Eaton would spend years in appeals. His death sentence, eventually overturned, would test every notion of finality the system had to offer. And long before the courts could close the last file, darker questions began to stir. Was Lisa Marie Kimmell his only victim? Or was she one of many lost to the deserts and the highways that thread the Great Basin, each story waiting for a name, a face, and a family still searching for answers? Next time, we'll confront the unfinished side of this case, the unraveling of Eaton's death sentence, the rumors of other victims, and the legacy Lisa left behind, the woman they called Little Miss, whose light still reaches across the Wyoming plains and whose story changed how this state pursues the missing, the murdered, and the forgotten. Every courtroom has a moment when it goes still, not because of the verdict, but because everyone finally understands the weight of what's been lost. For the Kimmell family, that silence wasn't the end of a trial. It was the echo of 16 years without her voice. 16 birthdays marked by photographs instead of candles. 16 winters that came and went without the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. Lisa Marie Kimmell wasn't defined by the stretch of highway or by the man who took her there. She was defined by the life that she built before it, a life filled with plans and kindness and motion. She loved small joys, the hum of her black Honda, the soft rhythm of rain on her window, and the promise that every road led somewhere worth going. She loved fiercely and believed deeply that the world could still be good and that people, given the chance, would choose to do right. Her mother, Sheila, carried that same belief long after the world tried to prove her wrong. When she burned down the place that held her daughter's final moments, it wasn't destruction, it was reclamation. A mother saying, "You don't get to own her story anymore." Lisa's name became a force for advocacy, for reform, for the relentless pursuit of justice. Through her, Wyoming learned that justice doesn't stop at the edge of a verdict. It continues in the families who keep speaking, in the officers who refuse to quit, and in every person who hears her story and refuses to forget. Lisa Marie Kimmell was 18, a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her dreams were taken, but her light remains, woven into every person who still whispers her name with love instead of fear. And tonight, as we close this chapter, we remember that light, because while her story was stolen, her legacy endures in every act of courage, in every fight for truth, and in every mile of road where justice still travels.
It's hard to imagine what it took for the Kimmell family to keep standing through all of that. 16 years of silence and then a trial that reopened every wound. But somehow, they still chose grace, not revenge.
Yeah, and I mean, where are you at with this whole story? You know, you're not hearing it for the first time. You grew up here the same as I did, so you know the story, but did you learn anything you didn't know, or?
I would say kind of, but not kind of, because I actually didn't know that they burned it down until you told me like weeks ago.
Oh, gotcha, yeah. So it wasn't new information for the episode, but yeah.
But man, I would have given to flick that match, you know?
No shit. I mean, you know, I've been a fireman, and, you know, we've been called out to burn properties and stuff like that before, burn buildings down and shit like that. Nothing like this. And where my mind goes is, my eyes could not have been dry. As a fireman out there, I imagine everybody was bawling.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine.
I can imagine they were honored, the firefighters, to have been a part of it.
Burn this piece of shit place to the ground. Yeah.
To be part of it, I mean, oof.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And, you know, the story pisses me off that Wyoming, I'm sorry, can't kill a freaking creep like this.
No.
Are you kidding me?
Is it morbid that I wish there was video of them burning the place down so we could see it?
I think there might be. I think there might have been news coverage of it. Yeah, I think there might have been news coverage of it.
Because I kind of feel like I need that closure too. Like, just watch it burn.
Yeah, and this son of a bitch is still rotting away in prison.
I know.
And, you know, I mean, if there was some hope that we could get a confession for the other shit that we know he's done, okay, but this son of a bitch is never talking.
No. He's just enjoying his 3 hots and a cot.
Yep. I mean, from what I understand, his mind is mush at this point, so...
But he enjoyed it for...
years.
Long? Yeah.
Well, 20... I don't know for sure when his mind went totally to mush, but, you know, I mean, it's been, 21 years since he was sentenced.
But now it's a different kind of enjoyment. Like, mind mush, he's probably enjoying that too.
Probably. But, too, I mean, we got to remember he was in prison, in federal prison in Littleton before he was transferred. So he's actually been in prison since he was recaptured after he likely killed Amy Bechtold because Wyoming couldn't keep the son of a bitch under lock and key where he belonged, which really pisses me off because if he would have been sentenced to prison for kidnapping a family,
no doubt,
there's a very good chance, if I'm right, there's a very good chance Amy Bechtold is still alive. And that shit should never be allowed.
Yeah.
Nobody, and we're seeing it more and more and more and more all over this country.
Yeah.
Nobody should walk free from kidnapping a family, from raping a woman, from murdering somebody. I mean, all this shit that these criminals walk away for, they need to be locked away so they can't do it anymore.
Exactly. I personally know of one Casper resident that would still be alive if... I don't know if it was Montana or Wyoming that let the bastard go, but... Yeah.
And you know, the sad truth is, the majority of the murders and shit like that occur could have been prevented if we would have locked these animals away when we had the chance.
Yeah, and I don't know where that guy is now. I'm not happy about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's tons and tons of those stories. They're running all over the freaking place.
I know.
Anyway, they didn't let Dale Eaton define the ending of their story. Burning down that property wasn't about hate. It was about reclaiming peace. It's one of those rare moments where justice and healing cross paths, even if just for a second.
And it says something about who Lisa was and the kind of strength she left behind in the people who loved her.
Exactly. Her legacy isn't the horror that took her. It's the determination that followed. Her story changed how Wyoming investigates cold cases. It showed what happens when families refuse to give up.
Next time, we'll look at what came after. The appeals, the overturned sentence, and the bigger question, was Lisa his only victim?
That's next time on Rocky Mountain Reckoning. If you believe in what we're doing, bringing truth to the surface and giving voices back to the silence, please take a second to like, follow, or subscribe wherever you listen. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next case. And if you're on YouTube, give the episode a thumbs up and share it.
I'm going to specify again, it's free to do that.
It is free and it takes like a second.
Free. You can also leave us a review, which is also free, and it helps more people find these stories. Join the Dark Dialogue Collective, our boots on the ground group helping with searches, logistics, and victim support. And you can also be part of Adopt a Victim, where listeners research unsolved cases and help bring answers home.
To support our work directly, visit us on Patreon or Ko-fi, and subscribe on Substack for behind-the-scenes updates and deeper case files. Everything, including episode links, updates, and contact forms, is at www.darkdialogue.com. And if you've got questions, case suggestions, or just want to reach out, email us anytime at info@darkdialogue.com. Until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, keep remembering, and above all, make the guilty face the reckoning.